Chuck Norris wasn't your typical celebrity. Sure, he had the fame, the movies, and the action hero reputation, but deep down, he was just a guy who liked to keep things simple. On this particular day, Chuck decided to take a break from his usual schedule of saving the world, or at least pretending to on-screen. He threw on a pair of jeans, slapped his trusty cowboy hat onto his head, and headed out for something completely ordinary: fried chicken. Now here's the twist. The fried chicken place he chose happened to be one of his own stores. Yep, Chuck owned a chain of restaurants called Chuck's Chicken Shack. It wasn't flashy or fancy. It was all about good food made with care. But even though it bore his name, Chuck hardly ever visited these places in person. He preferred staying out of the spotlight when he could. This time, though, he felt like indulging in some crispy comfort food, and besides, he wanted to see how things were running firsthand. When Chuck walked into the store, no one recognized him right away. The staff was swamped with customers, juggling orders left and right during the lunch rush. People were chatting loudly, kids were laughing, and the smell of sizzling chicken filled the air. Chuck joined the line, blending in seamlessly as just another hungry customer waiting for his turn. As he stood there, he couldn't help but overhear bits and pieces of conversations happening around him. Most of them were pretty normal stuff. Someone talking about last night's football game, another person complaining about traffic, a couple arguing over which side dish to order. Nothing too exciting. But then something unusual caught his attention. Two guys standing near him were whispering. At first, their voices were too low for anyone else to notice, but Chuck's ears perked up when he heard one of them say, "I can't believe it's real. $1 million just sitting there." That stopped Chuck dead in his tracks. His hand froze mid-air as he reached for the menu board. $1 million? What were they talking about? Who leaves that kind of money lying around? Curiosity got the better of him, and he tried to listen more closely without making it obvious. After all, Chuck Norris didn't become a legend by being nosy. He became a legend by paying attention to the little details. The two men continued their hushed conversation, glancing nervously around the room every few seconds. They must have thought they were being discreet, but Chuck noticed everything. One of them leaned closer to the other and said, "We'll hit it tonight. No one will suspect a thing." Chuck's stomach tightened. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't good. He'd spent enough years fighting bad guys, both in movies and in real life, to know trouble when he saw it. These weren't just random words, they were plotting something big, something dangerous. But before he could do anything, the cashier called out, "Next." Chuck stepped forward, putting on his best, "I'm just a regular guy" face. He ordered a bucket of fried chicken and extra biscuits, all while keeping one eye on the mysterious duo. Once they paid for their meals, they moved to a corner booth, still whispering quietly. Chuck grabbed his food and found a seat not far from them. He pretended to focus on his meal, tearing into a piece of chicken with gusto, but his mind was racing. Should he confront them, or should he try to gather more information first? Whatever the secret involved, it clearly had stakes higher than a casual robbery. Something told him this wasn't going to end well unless someone stepped in, and if there was one thing Chuck Norris knew how to do, it was step in when it mattered most. Chuck sat at his table, chewing slowly on a piece of fried chicken, but his mind wasn't on the food. His sharp eyes were fixed on the two men in the corner booth. They weren't eating much, just pushing their fries around their plates while whispering back and forth. Every now and then, one of them would glance toward the door or look over their shoulders like they were worried someone might be listening. It was clear these guys weren't just having a casual chat. Their body language screamed tension. One of them kept fidgeting with his napkin, tearing it into tiny pieces without even realizing it. The other guy tapped his fingers nervously on the table, his knuckles turning white. Chuck's instincts told him something big was about to go down. He leaned forward slightly, pretending to adjust his cowboy hat so he could hear better. Bits of their conversation floated across the room. "Tonight," one of them muttered. "We can't mess this up." The second man nodded, his voice barely audible. "If we play it smart, no one will know." Chuck's jaw tightened as he processed what he was hearing. These weren't ordinary people talking about skipping out on a bill or sneaking into a movie theater. They were planning something serious. He didn't need to be a detective to figure that out. The mention of tonight and the nervous glances gave away that timing was crucial. Whatever they had planned, it was happening soon. As Chuck listened, another phrase caught his ear. Hidden safe. That sent a chill down his spine. A hidden safe. What could possibly be inside it? Money, jewels, documents? And why were these two so confident they could get away with whatever they were plotting? Chuck's thoughts raced. He'd spent decades honing his skills, not just in martial arts, but in reading people. Over the years, he'd learned how to spot trouble before it started. These two weren't amateurs, they knew exactly what they were doing. But they also seemed jittery, like they were afraid of getting caught. That meant they weren't invincible. If Chuck acted fast, maybe he could stop them before things spiraled out of control. But there was a problem. Chuck was alone. Sure, he could take care of himself. He'd faced tougher situations than this. But going head-to-head with two potentially armed criminals in a public place wasn't the smartest move. Not only could innocent people get hurt, but Chuck didn't want to cause a scene either. For now, he needed to stay calm and gather more information. He glanced around the restaurant, trying to think of his next step. The staff was busy working behind the counter, oblivious to the drama unfolding right under their noses. Families chatted happily at nearby tables, completely unaware of the danger lurking in their midst. Chuck felt a surge of responsibility wash over him. This wasn't just about stopping a crime, it was about protecting everyone in the room. His gaze drifted back to the two men. They were finishing their drinks now, leaving cash on the table as they prepared to leave. Chuck tensed, ready to follow them if necessary. But just as they stood up, one of them said something that made Chuck freeze again. "Remember," the taller of the two whispered, "the warehouse is empty tonight. No guards, just us." Warehouse? Empty? No guards? Chuck's mind pieced together the puzzle quickly. These guys weren't just planning a random burglary, they were targeting a specific location. And judging by their confidence, they had inside knowledge about the place. Someone had tipped them off, someone who trusted them or paid them to keep quiet. Chuck watched as the pair walked toward the exit, their boots clicking against the tiled floor. He waited a few seconds, letting them get a head start, then grabbed his bucket of chicken and headed outside too. Standing near the doorway, he scanned the parking lot, spotting them climbing into an old blue pickup truck. They didn't look back once, clearly assuming no one was onto them. For a moment, Chuck considered jumping into his own car and tailing them. But he hesitated. Following them blind wouldn't solve anything. He needed a plan, a solid one, and, for that, he needed help. That's when an idea struck him. There was someone he could call, someone who owed him a favor from years ago. A sharp-witted investigator with experience handling high-stakes cases. Chuck pulled out his phone and dialed the number, keeping his voice low as he explained the situation. "You won't believe where I am," Chuck said, cutting straight to the point. "I'm at one of my chicken places and I just overheard. Two guys planning a heist. Big money's involved, like $1 million big. They're hitting some warehouse tonight." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then came the reply. "You're telling me you stumbled onto $1 million heist while buying fried chicken?" "It's true," Chuck replied, his tone dead serious. "And I need your help to shut it down." The person agreed to meet Chuck later that evening, giving him enough time to prepare. For now, Chuck decided to stick close to the suspects. He hopped into his car and followed them at a safe distance, making sure not to draw attention. As he drove, he replayed their conversation in his head, piecing together every detail. The mention of a hidden safe, the empty warehouse, the lack of security. It all pointed to something bigger than a simple robbery. By the time the sun began to set, Chuck had a clearer picture of what was going on. These guys weren't just after cash, they were after something valuable, something worth risking everything for. And Chuck knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let them succeed. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Chuck sat in his car, parked a safe distance away from the suspect's blue pickup truck. He wasn't just watching them, he was thinking. Every detail mattered, now. The way they spoke, the way they moved, Even the way they parked their truck told him something. These guys weren't seasoned criminals. They were amateurs trying to act like pros. And that meant they might make mistakes. Mistakes Chuck could exploit. As the evening rolled on, Chuck decided to dig deeper. He couldn't just sit back and wait for things to unfold. If there was one thing he'd learned over the years, it was that preparation made all the difference. So while keeping an eye on the suspects, he started asking around. Not directly, of course. Chuck knew how to blend in, how to strike up casual conversations without raising suspicion. He walked into a nearby gas station where the two men had stopped earlier. Leaning against the counter, he struck up a chat with the cashier. "Hey there," he said with a friendly smile. "I'm new to the area. What's the deal with that old warehouse on the outskirts of town? Looks like it's been abandoned for years." The cashier shrugged, wiping down the counter. "Oh, that place? It's not completely abandoned. Some company uses it to store stuff. Important stuff, I think. Heard they keep security tight most nights, but tonight's different. Something about maintenance or whatever. No guards." Chuck nodded thoughtfully, pretending to be only mildly interested. But inside, alarm bells were ringing. No guards. That confirmed what the suspects had whispered about. They weren't just guessing. They knew exactly what they were doing. Someone had given them insider information. Someone who worked at the warehouse or had connections to it. Whoever it was, they'd betrayed the trust placed in them. With this new piece of the puzzle, Chuck felt more certain than ever that he needed to act. This wasn't just a simple robbery anymore. There was more at stake here, something valuable enough to be worth $1 million. And if these guys succeeded, innocent people could get hurt. Maybe even worse, something important could be lost. Forever. Back in his car, Chuck called the investigator again. "Listen," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I found out more. The warehouse is being used by some kind of company. Tonight's supposed to be unguarded because of maintenance work. Whatever's inside that safe, it's big. We can't let them get away with it." The investigator agreed to meet Chuck near the warehouse later that night. Until then, Chuck kept tailing the suspects, making sure they didn't slip away. As darkness fell, the streets grew quieter. The suspects pulled into a small diner, probably grabbing a quick bite before heading to the warehouse. Chuck stayed parked across the street, his eyes glued to their movements. While waiting, he reflected on everything he'd uncovered so far. $1 million. An empty warehouse. A hidden safe. It all pointed to something bigger than greed. It was betrayal. Someone trusted with protecting that money or whatever else was inside had sold out, and if Chuck didn't step in, the fallout could be catastrophic. Finally, the suspects left the diner and drove off toward the outskirts of town. Chuck followed at a careful distance, his headlights dimmed to avoid detection. The road leading to the warehouse was dark and deserted, lined with overgrown trees that swayed eerily in the wind. When they reached the warehouse, the suspects parked their truck behind a cluster of bushes, clearly trying to hide it from view. Chuck parked farther, away, choosing a spot where he could observe without being seen. He grabbed a flashlight and a few basic tools from his trunk, just in case, and made his way closer on foot. The air was cool and still, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Chuck moved silently, his boots barely making a sound on the gravel path. When he got close enough, he crouched behind a stack of crates near the warehouse entrance. From his position, he could see the suspects unloading gear from their truck. One of them carried a crowbar, while the other held a flashlight. They glanced around nervously, checking for any signs of trouble. Chuck's heart raced as he watched them approach the heavy metal door of the warehouse. "All right," one of them muttered under his breath. "Let's do this quick. In and out." Chuck clenched his fists, his mind racing through the options. He could confront them now, but that would mean taking them on alone. Or he could wait for the investigator to arrive, which might give the suspects enough time to crack open the safe. Either way, timing was critical. Before he could decide, the suspects managed to pry open the door and slip inside. Chuck crept closer, staying in the shadows. Through the cracked doorway, he caught glimpses of the interior. a vast, dimly lit space filled with crates and shelves. The suspects moved quickly, heading straight for a corner where a large steel safe stood, bolted to the floor. One of them knelt beside the safe, pulling out a set of lock-picking tools. "This won't take long," he whispered confidently. "Just focus on keeping watch." But Chuck knew better. Nothing was ever as easy as it seemed, especially when it came to breaking laws. Still, he waited patiently, biding his time until the right moment to strike. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. The tension in the air was palpable. Chuck could hear the faint clicks and scrapes as the suspects worked on the safe. His muscles tensed, ready for action. He didn't know exactly what was inside that safe, but he knew one thing for sure. It wasn't going to fall into the wrong hands, not on his watch. And then, just as the lock began to give way, headlights appeared in the distance. The investigator had arrived. The headlights grew brighter as the car approached, breaking the eerie silence of the night. Chuck exhaled slowly, feeling a mix of relief and urgency. He'd been waiting for backup, but now that it had arrived, he knew the clock was ticking, faster than ever. The suspects were already inside the warehouse working on the safe, and they wouldn't stop just because someone else had shown up. Every second counted. Chuck signaled to the investigator, who parked their car a short distance away from the warehouse. They stepped out quietly, dressed in dark clothes with a flashlight in hand. Chuck met them halfway, keeping his voice low, so it wouldn't carry through the empty night air. "They're inside," Chuck whispered urgently. "One's trying to crack the safe while the other keeps watch. We need to move fast." The investigator nodded, scanning the area quickly. "What's the plan?" Chuck didn't hesitate. "You take the back entrance, I'll go in through the front. If we split up, we can corner them before they realize what's happening." It was a risky move, but Chuck trusted his instincts and the investigator's experience. This wasn't the first time they'd worked together, though their past collaborations usually involved less danger and more paperwork. Still, both of them understood the stakes here. Whatever was inside that safe wasn't meant for these two criminals, and letting them walk away with it could have consequences far beyond stolen money. With a quick nod, the investigator slipped off toward the rear of the warehouse, disappearing into the shadows. Chuck stayed put for a moment, listening for any sounds coming from inside. The faint metallic scraping continued, the sound of the lock being forced open. Time was running out. Taking a deep breath, Chuck moved forward, staying close to the wall of the warehouse. His boots made no noise against the gravel path, years of training ensuring he remained undetected. When he reached the cracked doorway, he paused, peering inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb, casting long shadows across the cluttered space. Crates and shelves lined the walls, creating natural hiding spots, but also making it harder to see everything clearly. Chuck spotted the two suspects immediately. One stood near the safe, hunched over with tools in hand, muttering under his breath. The other paced nervously nearby, glancing toward the entrance every few seconds. Their body language screamed tension. They knew they were taking a huge risk, and it showed in every twitch and fidget. Chuck stepped inside silently, moving, behind a stack of crates to keep himself hidden. He needed to get closer without alerting them. With slow, deliberate movements, he crept along the edge of the room, using the shadows to mask his presence. Each step felt like an eternity, but patience was key. Rushing in recklessly would only give them a chance to fight back or worse, escape. As he inched closer, the suspect working on the safe let out a triumphant grunt. "Got it!" he hissed, twisting the handle until the heavy door creaked open. Inside, nestled among papers and files, was a small metal case. It gleamed faintly in the dim light, its importance obvious even from a distance. "What is that?" the second man asked, leaning in to get a better look. "Doesn't matter," the first replied sharply. "Grab it and let's go. We've got maybe 5 minutes before someone notices we're here." Chuck's heart pounded. Now was the moment. He couldn't wait any longer. Stepping out from behind the crates, he spoke in a calm but commanding voice. "Gentlemen, you might want to rethink your plans." Both men froze, their heads snapping toward him in shock. For a split second, they just stared, unable to process how this stranger had appeared out of nowhere. Then panic set in. The one holding the metal case lunged toward Chuck, swinging wildly with a crowbar he'd been carrying. Chuck sidestepped effortlessly, dodging the clumsy attack with ease. Before the man could recover, Chuck delivered a precise kick to his wrist, sending the crowbar clattering to the floor. The suspect stumbled backward, clutching his arm in pain. Meanwhile, the second man scrambled to grab something, a weapon, anything, to defend himself. But before he could act, the investigator burst in from the back entrance shouting, "Police! Don't move!" Caught between Chuck and the investigator, the two suspects realized they were trapped. One dropped to his knees, raising his hands in surrender while the other tried to bolt for the exit. Chuck moved faster, stepping into his path and planting a firm hand on his shoulder. The man froze, realizing resistance was futile. Within moments, both suspects were disarmed and subdued, their earlier bravado completely gone. The investigator called for backup, explaining the situation to the dispatcher in clipped tones. Sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. As the authorities closed in, Chuck retrieved the metal case from the safe. He opened it carefully, revealing stacks of cash bundled neatly inside. $1 million, just as the suspects had whispered about earlier. But there was more. Documents detailing charity donations tied to medical research grants. This money wasn't just wealth, it represented hope for countless lives. Chuck exchanged a glance with the investigator, who shook their head in disbelief. These guys weren't just stealing money, they said quietly. They were robbing people of hope. Chuck nodded grimly. And that's why we stopped them. By the time the police arrived, the scene was secure. Officers swarmed the warehouse, taking statements and collecting evidence. The suspects were handcuffed and loaded into patrol cars, their faces pale with fear. Chuck watched as they were driven away, knowing justice would be served. As the chaos settled, Chuck leaned against the hood of his car, finally allowing himself a moment to breathe. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a sense of satisfaction. Another day, another mission accomplished. But this time it hadn't been about fame or glory. It had been about protecting something bigger than himself. The investigator joined him, offering a grateful smile. "You know," they said, "most people would have walked away after overhearing that conversation at the restaurant. Not many would have stuck around to see where it led." Chuck shrugged modestly. "Sometimes doing the right thing means sticking around, even if it starts with fried chicken." The night air was cool and quiet as Chuck stood outside the warehouse leaning against his car. The flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers illuminated the area, casting long shadows that danced across the ground. Officers bustled around, securing evidence, questioning witnesses, and ensuring the scene was fully under control. Chuck watched it all unfold with a calm expression, though his mind was still racing. He couldn't shake the weight of what he'd just uncovered. $1 million in cash. That was enough to buy houses, cars, or even start entire businesses. But this money wasn't meant for personal gain. It was earmarked for something far more important: charity donations tied to medical research grants. These funds were supposed to help save lives, not line the pockets of two greedy criminals. If they'd succeeded, countless people could have been robbed of hope. Hope for cures, treatments, and breakthroughs that might one day change the world. Chuck felt a pang of anger mixed with relief. Anger because someone had betrayed the trust placed in them by selling out the location and timing of the unguarded warehouse. Relief because he'd managed to stop the suspects before they disappeared into the night with their ill-gotten prize. The investigator approached him, holding a clipboard filled with notes. "We're wrapping things up here," they said, their voice tinged with exhaustion but also satisfaction. "Backup's taken over. You did good tonight." Chuck nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the warehouse. "It's not just about stopping them, you know. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. Someone tipped these guys off. Someone trusted with guarding that money decided to sell it out instead." The investigator sighed heavily. "Yeah, I've already got a team looking into that. Whoever it is, they'll answer for it. Betrayal like this, it cuts deep. Chuck didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced down at the metal case sitting on the hood of his car. Its contents, $1 million in neatly stacked bills, had been carefully counted and documented by the authorities. For now, it was safe. But the thought of what could have happened if he hadn't acted weighed heavily on him. You ever think about how small choices can lead to big consequences? Chuck asked suddenly, breaking the silence. The investigator raised an eyebrow, curious. What do you mean? Chuck gestured toward the warehouse. These guys, they didn't wake up one morning and decide to steal $1 million. They probably started small. Maybe they saw an opportunity and convinced themselves no one would get hurt. One bad choice leads to another, and before you know it, you're standing in a dark warehouse, cracking open a safe, wondering if you're going to
get caught.
The investigator nodded thoughtfully. You're right. People don't usually turn evil overnight. It's a slippery slope. Exactly, Chuck said, his tone firm. And that's why we have to hold the line. Even when it seems like no one's watching, even when it feels like no one cares, we've got to do the right thing. Because every time we don't, the world gets a little darker. There was a pause, the kind of quiet moment where words weren't needed. Both Chuck and the investigator understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about protecting something bigger than themselves. Hope, trust, justice. As the last of the officers packed up their gear and drove away, Chuck turned to the investigator. So, what happens next? They'll interrogate the suspects, dig into their backgrounds, and figure out who helped them pull this off, the investigator replied. With any luck, we'll find the insider soon enough, and once we do, they trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Chuck nodded. Good. Let me know if you need anything else from my side. The investigator smiled faintly. Honestly, after tonight, I think you've done more than enough. Go home, get some rest, you've earned it. Chuck chuckled softly, tipping his cowboy hat back slightly. Rest sounds nice, but first, I think I'll swing by the chicken place again tomorrow. Might grab another bucket. All this hero work makes a guy hungry. The investigator laughed, shaking their head. Only you, Chuck, only you. The aftermath. The next morning, news of the foiled heist spread quickly. Local reporters flocked to the warehouse, eager to piece together the story. How had such a bold plan been stopped? Who had intervened to prevent disaster? Rumors swirled, but details remained scarce, at least officially. Chuck stayed out of the spotlight, declining interviews and refusing to comment on the events of the previous night. He didn't need recognition or praise. His reward came from knowing he'd made a difference, however small, in the grand scheme of things. Meanwhile, investigators worked tirelessly to identify the insider who had betrayed the company. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. A disgruntled employee, bitter over being passed over for a promotion, had leaked the information about the unguarded warehouse in exchange for a cut of the stolen funds. When confronted, the employee broke down, confessing everything. They claimed they'd only wanted to teach the company a lesson, not realizing the harm they might cause. Back at Chuck's chicken shack, life returned to normal. Customers streamed in during lunch hours, unaware of the drama that had unfolded just days earlier. Employees served meals with smiles, chatting casually about weekend plans and favorite menu items. To most, it was just another ordinary day at a local restaurant chain, but for Chuck, it was a reminder of how unpredictable life could be. What had started as a simple craving for fried chicken had turned into a mission to protect something priceless. It wasn't the first time fate had thrown him into unexpected situations, and it likely wouldn't be the last. That evening, as Chuck sat alone in his living room, he reflected on everything that had happened. The suspects, the stolen money, the betrayal. It all felt surreal now, like something out of one of his old action movies. But this wasn't Hollywood. This was real life, with real stakes and real consequences. He leaned back in his chair, sipping a cup of coffee, and allowed himself a small smile. No matter how many times he stepped into danger, no matter how many villains he faced, one thing remained constant: the belief that doing the right thing mattered. Whether it was saving lives, protecting hope, or simply lending a hand when it was needed most. Every act of kindness or bravery added up to something greater. And if anyone asked him how it all began, Chuck would simply grin and say, "It started with a craving for fried chicken." Because sometimes, even the simplest moments could lead to extraordinary outcomes. The days following the warehouse incident passed quickly, but the ripple effects of Chuck's actions continued to spread. News outlets picked up snippets of the story, though most of the details remained under wraps due to the ongoing investigation. Headlines like, "Local hero thwarts million-dollar heist and mystery man saves medical research funds" popped up across town, sparking curiosity among locals. People whispered about who might have been behind the intervention, speculating wildly about vigilantes, undercover cops, or even superheroes. Chuck, of course, stayed far away from the spotlight. When reporters showed up at his doorstep, or rather outside the gates of his ranch, he politely declined interviews with a simple wave of his hand and a smile that said everything without uttering a word. He didn't need recognition. He knew what mattered most was the outcome. The money had been recovered, the suspects were in custody, and the insider responsible for tipping them off was facing charges for betrayal. Justice would be served, not because of fame or glory, but because someone chose to step in when it counted. Still, the story wasn't just about stopping a crime. It went deeper than that. For Chuck, it reinforced something he'd always believed: that every action, no matter how small, has the power to create change. Whether it's deciding to help a stranger, standing up against wrongdoing, or simply paying attention when others might look away, those little moments add up. And sometimes, they lead to something extraordinary. A ripple effect as the investigation unfolded. More pieces of the puzzle came together. The company that owned the warehouse released a statement thanking law enforcement, and whoever had intervened, for their role in protecting the funds. Those dollars weren't just numbers on paper. They represented years of hard work by scientists, researchers, and donors dedicated to finding cures for diseases that affected millions of people worldwide. Losing that money wouldn't just delay progress. It could have derailed entire projects, leaving patients waiting longer for breakthroughs that could save lives. Word of Chuck's involvement eventually reached the CEO of the pharmaceutical company. They sent him a handwritten letter expressing gratitude, calling him a guardian angel for stepping in when no one else could. Chuck read the note once, folded it carefully, and tucked it into a drawer. He didn't need awards or accolades to feel proud of what he'd done. Knowing the money was safe and the research could continue was reward enough. But the impact didn't stop there. Employees at the warehouse, shaken by the betrayal of one of their own, rallied together to strengthen security protocols. The company implemented stricter oversight measures, ensuring nothing like this could happen again. Conversations around trust, loyalty, and responsibility became part of daily discussions, not just within the organization, but among families and communities touched by the story. Even at Chuck's Chicken Shack locations, employees found inspiration in the events. Stories circulated about how their boss, yes, the Chuck Norris, had gone above and beyond to protect something bigger than himself. It reminded everyone that being part of a team meant looking out for each other and taking pride in doing good work. Morale soared, and customers noticed the difference. Some even joked that the fried chicken tasted better now, as if infused with a bit of heroism. Back to normal, sort of. For Chuck, life returned to its usual rhythm, or as close to normal as it ever got for someone like him. Days were spent riding horses on his ranch, tinkering with old trucks in the garage, or practicing martial arts in the barn-turned-training ground. Nights were quieter, filled with books, late-night documentaries, and the occasional bowl of ice cream while watching classic westerns. But beneath the surface, the experience lingered in subtle ways. He started noticing patterns in everyday conversations, the way people spoke about challenges they faced, the excuses they made, or the opportunities they missed. It made him think about the choices people make and how those decisions shape not only their own lives, but also the lives of others. Sometimes, he'd share stories with friends over coffee, not to boast, but to remind them of the importance of staying alert and stepping up when needed. One evening, during a casual dinner with longtime buddies, the topic turned to the recent headlines. Someone brought up the warehouse incident, asking Chuck if he'd heard anything about it. Chuck smirked, cutting into his steak with deliberate slowness. "Funny you should ask," he said, his tone light and teasing. "I might have been in the area when it happened." His friends burst out laughing, knowing full well they'd never get a straight answer from him. That was Chuck. Always humble, always mysterious. But deep down, they suspected he'd played a role. After all, it wasn't the first time he'd stepped in to fix something broken. Legacy of quiet courage. What struck Chuck most about the whole ordeal was how easily it could have gone unnoticed. If he hadn't decided to grab fried chicken that day, if he hadn't overheard the whispered conversation, if he hadn't followed his instincts and stuck around, none of it would have happened. The suspects might have succeeded, disappearing into the night with the money and leaving chaos in their wake. It was a reminder that heroes aren't always the ones wearing capes or standing in the spotlight. Sometimes they're ordinary people, making extraordinary choices. A teacher staying late to help a struggling student. A neighbor lending a hand after a storm. A parent working 2 jobs to give their kids a better future. These acts may seem small, but they matter a lot. For Chuck, the experience reinforced his belief in humanity's potential for good. Sure, there were bad apples in the world, people willing to betray trust, break laws, or hurt others for personal gain, but for every wrong choice, there was someone ready to stand up and say, "Not today." That balance kept the world turning, inch by inch, toward something brighter. The final thought weeks later, Chuck found himself back at the same chicken shack where it all began. This time, he arrived early in the morning before the lunch rush, to check on operations and chat with the staff. As he walked through the doors, the smell of freshly fried chicken greeted him like an old friend. He exchanged smiles with employees, asked how things were going, and shared a few laughs about customer quirks. When the line started forming, Chuck took a seat near the window, sipping black coffee and watching the world go by. A young family entered, their kids giggling as they debated between drumsticks and thighs. An elderly couple sat nearby, reminiscing about road trips and favorite recipes. Life moved forward, steady and unbroken, carrying the weight of countless untold stories. Chuck felt a sense of peace wash over him. Not because he'd stopped a $1 million heist, but because he'd played a small part in keeping hope alive. In a world often dominated by noise and chaos, moments like these reminded him why he did what he did. Every person mattered. Every choice mattered. And every act of kindness, no matter how simple, could leave a lasting mark. If anyone asked him later why he kept showing up, why he kept stepping in when others might walk away, Chuck would shrug and offer a grin. Because, he'd say, sometimes all it takes is one person to make a difference. And hey, who doesn't love a good bucket of fried chicken while saving the day?